Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be talking about three different things. So there's going to be three parts to this podcast today, or this episode. We're going to be talking about section 19 from the Doctrine and Covenants. And this is, once we get to section 20, if you don't know, section 20, 21, and 22, that's kind of the organization of the church. It is the organization of the church. So we're still in 1829, which is a very big year, obviously, for the revelations of Joseph Smith. But we're going to be talking about section 19. We're also going to be talking about Joseph Smith's letter book and a revelation that was never published. So those are the three parts. Section 19, a little bit about some things in between all of these sections before we get to section 20. And then we're going to get into, like I said, a revelation that was never actually published in any way. So I'm going to experiment with something on that one just to warn you. And it's just an experiment because I'm an amateur. Is that I am going to actually read off the revelation that was never published. So just so that you know, if you're wondering at the end of all this, there's going to be a very long section where I just read it out because I know some of you only use the audio. So hopefully that's helpful. If it's not, let me know. But otherwise, it's just one of those things that you never really see. And excuse me, I'm also getting over something here. I would also like to say that this episode is very exciting for me personally, because the real reason why I was interested in sharing things that I've learned from reading the Joseph Smith papers is that you get revelations that were never recorded and that you've maybe never seen. These are actual revelations, sometimes given in very official ways, like we've seen. And the other one is that we also get to sort of fill in some of the things that you may have also never seen before, just kind of giving a proper context to why things are happening the way they do. In one case, we're going to be talking specifically about Martin Harris's money and specifically about how that ended, because there's some misperceptions about what happened with Martin Harris. There's a whole South Park episode about this where he's being called dumb and Joseph Smith kind of duped him, and a lot of people accused him of that. And there's some concrete evidence that we have now that shows the proper ending to all of that. So again, clearing the air, getting the proper history down, and maybe even filling in a few things. That's why we call it Filling in the History. So let's get started. I'm talking too much. Part 1, Section 19. What we get in the Joseph Smith papers, again, this is Documents Volume 1, which is a chronological history of where these sections come about. What we get is that chapter or section 17, as we now have it, comes directly before section 19. In the manuscript history of the church, which is a history that we used for a very long time, drafts 1, 2, and 3 all show the title page of the Book of Mormon. And as you can see here, very super fancy handwriting, which I think is very impressive. I think calligraphy is a wonderful thing. Anyway, so that's what you get as the actual title page from the Book of Mormon in the manuscript history of the church, what used to be called History of the Church, Volume 1, what is called History of the Church, Volume 1. So just leading up to it in terms of where the Joseph Smith papers places this particular revelation. And so what do we get? The paper's introduction to section 19. So the earliest copies that we have of this is in Revelation Book 1. Now, we only get the last half of it. So the earliest complete copy that we find is in the Book of Commandments. So there are more or less like 2 pages, I would say like a page and maybe a quarter or a half, that are missing from that gathering that was taken out and never brought back. But the good news is from this point henceforth, most of the revelations that were originally in the Revelation books 1 and 2, we will be able to see. And so I think this whole idea of, hey, the best thing we can find is the Book of Commandments has come to a close. So, and in the Book of Commandments, it is shown as chapter 16. In the Doctrine and Covenants copy, it is found in section 44, again, published 2 years later. And so from the source note, again, Book of Commandments is the first very complete copy that we have, probably given in the summer of 1829 and not in March 1830, as is stated in the introduction to the Book of Commandments introduction. So again, this is where the Joseph Smith papers corrects some things that may be misunderstood. That March 1830 date comes out of a lot of the history of the church, the manuscript history of the church. So the circumstances surrounding this. This revelation is dictated to Martin Harris, and so if you know anything about church history, a very major part of this, I've gone over to this in a lot of detail, is that Joseph Smith really wanted to publish a lot of these books. This is a very large publishing project for Palmyra, New York at this time. A lot of pages, and it's going to be very expensive. And they want to publish 5,000 copies, which is a lot of copies of any book. And I'm going to go into some numbers about this later on. So in order to pay for this, the Smith family didn't have this kind of money. Martin Harris kind of didn't have this kind of money either, but he winds up mortgaging his property. So why do that? I want to get into the details of this because what's really interesting about, again, the enormous amount of work that these people have done, the editors of this papers project, is the kind of forensics that they've found, which is really cool. So we're going to get into the terms of this mortgage and all sorts of details. So from the historical introduction, from Documents Volume 1, we get, in June 1829, before this revelation was dictated, Harris and Joseph Smith talked with several printers in Palmyra and Rochester, New York, about printing the Book of Mormon, finally settling on E.B. Grandin of Palmyra. John H. Gilbert, a compositor who assisted Grandin in estimating the cost of the project and later typeset the Book of Mormon, recalled that Harris initiated the negotiations and planned to pay for the printing. Gilbert also remembered that Grandin would not begin work or purchase the needed type from the foundry until after Harris had promised to ensure the payment for the printing. Grandin's price to print 5,000 copies was $3,000, which would require Harris to impart essentially all of the property to which he had legal right. Printing began in September of 1829, if you didn't know. So, footnote 7 from this, and we've talked about this a little bit more in history, says, Harris had previously deeded 80 acres of his property to his wife, Lucy, in 1825, though the deed was not recorded until May of 1828, leaving at least 151 acres under Harris's control. That transfer to Lucy Harris was apparently part of a jointure agreement whereby she received her marital interest, often referred to as a dowry interest, from Martin. Historian Andrew Jensen later noted that Lucy Harris partially separated from him, which he patiently endured for the gospel's sake. So more or less, this would be kind of like a post-nuptial agreement in today's terms. So it seems that there was about 80 acres that Lucy Harris brought to the marriage when Martin and Lucy were married. And way back in 1825, this is way before plates and Joseph Smith and stuff, she says, I want my stuff back. And apparently in May 1828, when like things were getting kind of going with the Book of Mormon, she was like, I really need to execute on this so that you don't use my land for your money to give to this project. She didn't want that, which I actually kind of understand. I think that's, and he did. So I think it actually makes a whole lot of sense. So that was why he did what he did. Now, if it's not said, and I'm just going to say this maybe more than once, there is no, it's not like, McGraw-Hill today, where McGraw-Hill's a publisher. In this case, this is a shop front where you have a printing press upstairs. You have your own bookstore, okay? And a lot of times the publisher would be in on trying to make his money back just like the writer or the author would. So in this case, apparently he didn't have even the type set, so you have to go to a foundry to get the little letters. We actually still use this term today in fonts, if you're not aware. Foundries create different fonts. They're obviously not forging things anymore, but the concept is the same. Is the font that you're using would have been forged by somebody who is very highly specialized in doing that. So E.B. Grandin had to buy the fonts or the typeface, the actual metal pieces that were used in the print. The supplies, the paper, the ink, all that kind of stuff. And usually what you would do is like maybe hand over your copyright to the printer so that you would have an equal sort of impetus to make money back. In this case, Joseph Smith got the copyright for himself, never sold it to Grandin, and Martin Harris paid him up front. So Grandin had no skin in the game after this. He fulfilled his obligation. He printed 5,000 really great copies of the Book of Mormon, leather bound them, the whole thing, got it done. And then he didn't care. He already had his money. And we'll get into some of what that meant later on. But that was the main reason why Martin Harris, and he's admonished in section 19 to not covet his property and give it to the printing of the Book of Mormon, which he did. So a couple of things to put this into context. I was curious. I get upset about inflation. I'm sure a lot of people do. So I was curious about this. What would printing the Book of Mormon cost today? Now, as of this recording, this is March of 2025. So what would it cost today? Well, $3,000 in 1830, according to what's called the CPI inflation calculator, which is a website that you can visit. $3,000 in 1830 is $102,914.67 today. That's a lot of money. However, what's $3,000 divided by 151 acres? Now, I don't know. I'm guessing here, but let's just say he gave it all up, right? 150 acres. That means that the cost of an acre, or what you could sell an acre for or mortgage an acre for in 1830, was $19.87. It costs a little more for land today. So that means in today's dollars, 102,914, so forth, divided by 151. If that number was true, then you can buy land in Palmyra, New York, today in 2025 for $681. So how true is that? Well, if you go to landsearch.com, you can look up buying land. The average cost of farmland in upstate New York as of March 2025 is $3,600. So it's not samesies, right? Which means if it's $3,600 and you had 151 acres, that's $543,600. So let's just make believe for a moment that that is what Martin Harris did, just to give you a size of or a sense of how much money this man put up, if you want to put it in today's dollars. Over $500,000 in today's currency. So what I then did is there's a great website, and I'm not sponsored by them, but I think they're great. They're called gatekeeperpress.com. And if you want to go publish books, you can go publish books. So I put in there's 590 pages at a standard size. So a standard size would be a lot like this today. Okay. The Book of Mormon was smaller than this, but I'm just kind of keeping things standard to save on money, right? So they didn't ask for any wacky paper sizes back in 1830. They asked for what was standard. So that's what we're doing. That's now more like an 8.5 by 11 or 8.5 by 10. Anyway, so let's say that we're printing a book today, 590 pages. We want 5,000 copies. We're just going to print it in black and white. That wasn't really an option back then. But anyway, it was a black and white. There's no dust jacket, right? It's just a leather-bound book. It would cost $94,500 to print it because they were in the same town. That's why I put that there. It would cost, in today's dollars, $10,009.95 for shipping. That's a lot of paper, right? And then the total to print and ship this book, which, again, they didn't do the shipping back then, but the total would be $104,509.95 to print a book today at 5,000 copies, which means how much does it cost per copy? $18.90 to print a book from Gateway Press or gatekeeperpress.com. Now, I have to assume that maybe if you're with a larger publisher, it might be a little less than that. We're thinking, I know I've looked around on the internet, like anywhere from $12 to $16 per book. And this is without a dust jacket or any fancy stuff, right? So that could be more money. Anyway, so how much would it cost? 5,000 copies for $3,000 per print. So back then, the Book of Mormon cost $1.66 per copy to create. And that means that the book in today's dollars would cost $57.32 to create. Now, Gatekeeper Press can get it to you for $18.90. So it's kind of funny how, like, land costs more than it would have back then, but printing cost way more back then than it does now. Obviously, we have a lot more technology now. So, shout out to Gatekeeper Press for keeping the price down. It doesn't cost us $57 just to make a book. So anyway, but to kind of give you a sense of maybe in today's dollars how this would have worked. But yeah, if you said, hey, we're going to print 5,000 books. And the guy's like, well, it costs you $58 per copy to print it. And then you need to sell even more than that. Now, the original number was, let's sell this for $1.75. They had to back that down. So it was kind of hard to make a profit from this. I mean, would you buy a book from somebody you didn't know for basically $58? Is a lot, or more than that, probably. Could be 70, could be 80. I did it because a lot of the Joseph Smith papers are, but I'm an amateur historian, so don't listen to me. Anyway, so just a couple of numbers there. Maybe too much detail, but a couple of numbers there. So the historical introduction here continues. This is from Documents, Volume 1. Once Harris mortgaged his property, however, Grandin considered himself paid in full. According to Gilbert, printing then proceeded. As quick as Mr. Grandin got his type and got things all ready to commence the work, Hiram Smith brought to the office 24 pages of manuscript on full scrap paper. And that's from you can look at those, a few of those, on the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. He brought 24 of those pages over. Now, did he bring over the original manuscript? I correct myself. No, there was a printer's manuscript written, and that's what traveled with him. And you can look at that, all of those, on the Joseph Smith Papers website. Now, what's fun about this, too, is that I would like to think they did it in chronological order. That's how the history sort of describes it. So they would take what's called a gathering, like this, 24 pages at a time. And then once they were done with what they needed, they would take those back, and then they would bring back another 24 pages or so. And then we have all this in the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which we have recently required in the church. So it's kind of fun. So the footnote to this, Harris's mortgage essentially paid for the cost of printing before the first page came off the press. Since Grandin's investment was secured, he had no financial interest in whether the Book of Mormon sold well or not. This helps explain why there is no evidence Grandin was alarmed by the activities of Abner Cole, who, using Grandin's print shop and press, began illicitly printing pages of the Book of Mormon in January of 1830 in the Palmyra Reflector, which is a newspaper. Even after the Book of Mormon was available for purchase beginning in late March of 1830, Grandin continued to allow Cole to use his press to deride the Book of Mormon. So if you don't know, illegal copies were printed in a newspaper, and I have a story about that later on. So he's just like, yeah, I don't care. I already have my money. We're good. So what are the terms of this mortgage that we keep talking about? Well, according to the Joseph Smith Papers, the mortgage did not require Harris to make regular payments. And for the full 18-month term, very short, of the mortgage, Harris was entitled to occupy his property. He retained the option of selling it at any time and paying off Grandin from the profits. If Harris defaulted on the mortgage, Grandin could legally sell the property to obtain the money. If the property sold for more than $3,000, Harris would be legally entitled to the excess. Grandin sold the mortgage in October of 1830 for $2,000 cash to his wife's great-uncle, Thomas Rogers II, a transaction that may have been part of a larger financial deal. When Harris's property was eventually sold, Rogers collected the full $3,000 from the buyer, Thomas Lakely. So, there you go. As far as I know, he did not default on the mortgage. The manuscript history gives a little different introduction to this, which is all we had for a very long time. It is. So everything I've given you is what you get out of the Joseph Smith Papers. What we used to have in our history is from the manuscript history. This is coming from draft 2. Is a commandment of God and not of man to Martin Harris, given Manchester, New York, March 1830, by him who is eternal. So hopefully I've given you a little bit more detail than that. So where was the actual type coming from? So now we're getting into the actual printing of the Book of Mormon. Footnote 12 here is that there were no type foundries in the Palmyra area. Although there was a small foundry in Albany, Grandin more likely purchased the type in New York City. If he did not travel there to get it until after 25 of August, 1829, it is unlikely he returned before September. Cowdery reported to Joseph Smith in early November that the work, though proceeding slowly, was well underway, with completion expected in February. And so we get a portion of this, which is kind of fun, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more. But at this point in the history, we start actually getting other volumes, other methods of creating histories like journals, and in this case, a letter book. And I'm going to get into this letter book in more detail. But what I love about this is an Oliver Cowdery letter written to Joseph Smith that Joseph Smith copies into the letter book with his own hand. So even though this is Joseph Smith's handwriting, it's Oliver Cowdery's letter. Kind of funny. Anyway, so this is what you get from that, from Oliver Cowdery. The printing goes rather slow, yet as the type founder has been sick, but we expect that the type will be on, and Mr. Grandin, E.B. Grandin, still think he will finish printing by the 1st of February. Sometimes you got to call out sick. We can conclude, therefore, that the printing process took from around September of 1829 to February of 1830, which is about 7 months. So I don't know if you knew that either, but it took about 6 or 7 months. And, who knows how, maybe you take Christmas off. I'm not sure how this works back then, but yeah, call it 6 months, maybe 7, to print 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon. And it was released to the public in sort of late winter, upstate New York. So some details from the revelation itself that I thought were very interesting. And I think I might have found something out there, you Joseph Smith Papers editors. I think I found something that you might have missed. If you go to verse 37 in the Book of Commandments, or what would be called verse 35 in today's edition, we have the quote here, pay the printer's debt, which is from the original, versus what we have today, which is pay the debt thou hast contracted with the printer. Now, this is from, like, you see this in the Revelation book, 1, in Book of Commandments, but then when the Doctrine and Covenants comes out in 1835, they changed this language, and it stays that way forever. There's no notes on this. I have no explanation for you from the Joseph Smith Papers. Did the amateur historian point out something nobody else saw? Does anybody care? Who knows? Stay tuned. But yeah, there are no notes. There's no indication of why this changed. And I can't see anything from the Revelation books. So I think something might have been missed here. And that's, kind of that's a commandment from the Lord, if you will, in this revelation. And we don't really get a sense of why that might have changed or where that would have changed. So I don't have an explanation for you, but there is a wording change there. The other thing that I find interesting is that in the early sections of this, and this is, if you don't know, if you're not a member of the church, section 19 is, it cannot be understated how enormously important this is to our understanding of God and what we call the atonement of Jesus Christ. So there's a lot in here. One thing I find very interesting is we also get a chart of your eternal punishment. Nice to have a chart for your punishment. Verse 12 in the Book of Commandments and in verse 2 of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, which is now verses 11 and 12 in our current edition, you have this eternal punishment is God's punishment. Endless punishment is God's punishment. And those are kind of put in this sort of weird table form. We don't do that today in today's scriptures, but it's sort of this comparison of the two. And what the Lord is sort of explaining here is that even though that's what is written, it doesn't mean it never, ever, ever ends, which is kind of an interesting side note to Mormon theology a little bit, Latter-day Saint theology, I should say, is that we believe that there is some sort of an end to that for most people. I'm not going to get into the whole details of that. This doesn't really get further described, these verses, I would submit, until section 76. So we've got a long time to go. Section 76 is the panorama of what we call the entire plan of salvation, which is a very different thing from traditional Christianity, where we don't believe necessarily that you die, you go to heaven or hell, and there you are forever. We believe that you die, you do go to a good place or a bad place, so to speak. I'm just keeping this simple. But that there's more to it after that. That there are several things after that. And that we have a greater explanation of how do we live forever sort of thing. And are we punished forever and ever and ever? You can be the judge of that, because there's some, personal interpretation that can go into that, which I think is fair. But these scriptures and this table of punishment, as I like to call it, doesn't really get more thoroughly described until section 76. So if I can survive until then, because this cold is killing me, we'll get into that. So, but for now, I just thought it was interesting. If you look in the original copies and in the Revelation books, you're going to see this as a chart, which I thought was kind of interesting. After this follows the command to repent, the visual imaging of the atonement of Christ bleeding from every pore literally, and the success of Jesus performing the actual atonement. So that's why this section is really very important. I have a hard time thinking of a general conference where this hasn't been mentioned. It is a very, very important sort of description from a personal perspective from the Lord about how the atonement was wrought. So very, very important. And what this does in Latter-day Saint theology, I would submit, is that this is the moment where Gethsemane joins the cross in the atonement process. And it sort of changes how we think about what Jesus Christ did for humanity. And so it fills in this story quite a lot. Very, very important. Like I said, it can't be understated how important these scriptures are to Latter-day Saint theology. Even though what we're talking about is you really need a mortgage or farm to print the Book of Mormon, we get these gems of Latter-day Saint doctrine in section 19. So it's all kind of mixed together. It's a lot of this, the temporal and the spiritual are inseparable. So yeah, anyway, very important section. So all that being done, we do get a footnote from the Book of Commandments version. So as you're reading through this, verse 25 from the Book of Commandments, which is the same verse in today's, it's verse 25 in today's, you get this idea of do not covet your neighbor's wife. And it's like, where is that coming from? So I get this footnote, which I thought was enlightening. Lucy Harris, after she was estranged from Martin, insinuated publicly that he had carried on an illicit relationship with the wife of Daniel Haggard, who was living on his property at the time. And that's all you get. There's really nothing about that. So I don't know if that's true or not, but yeah, there is an admonishment in the middle of this section. So, again, I'll leave the rest of it for you to read, but yeah, that's section 19. And as we come up to the next thing, we're going to be talking about some of the rest of this part of the Documents Volume 1, which I like to call the preface, a letter book, and a promise. So stay tuned for that. All right, part 2 is what I call the preface, a letter book, and a promise. So there's a few documents. We're getting into some of the fun stuff of what normally is in the Joseph Smith papers, meaning that it's not just like a bunch of sections or the Book of Mormon, like these big things that you see. Now we're starting to fill it out. Now there's letter books, there's journals, there's other documents to look at. We're going to look at those right now. So what we get is something called the preface to the Book of Mormon. This is not the title page. This is not a witness's page. This is a preface to the Book of Mormon. And I would say that this custom of publication is carried on to this day. So you have, you have an explanatory introduction to the plates. You have an introduction into what the Book of Mormon actually is. This is for people who are maybe looking into the church, reading the Book of Mormon for the first time and explaining what it is. In 1830, it was a lot more fighting words. So this is a lot about, hey, there was 116 pages. Somebody stole them. It was the Book of Lehi. We're not publishing them again. And actually, Joseph Smith even quotes part of the revelation that said, these people are doing this for bad reasons. Do not retranslate these scriptures. So that's what we get. And it falls in Documents Volume 1, in the chronology of the papers, in between section 19 and the rest of what we get in the early Doctrine and Covenants. So the historical introduction that we get, and the earliest copy that we find of this, by the way, is in the first Book of Mormon edition. This is 1830, so we don't have a handwritten edition of this or anything like that. Historical introduction says, included as part of the first 16-page gathering of the Book of Mormon, the preface is thus Joseph Smith's first autobiographical account to appear in print. Kind of fun. As well as the first publication of any portion of his revelations. So the quotation of the revelations that we're talking about here inside of the preface is, and being commanded of the Lord that I should not translate the same over again, for Satan had put it into their hearts to tempt the Lord their God by altering the words, etc., etc., etc. So that is the revelation that Joseph had already received. So if you want to know the very first publication of the history of the church, the very first publication of any kind of revelation outside of the Bible or the Book of Mormon is here in the preface. So it's an important step. And basically, that's what it is. You can read that. The reason why I say this is the first is because that portion of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon is now lost to us. So the earliest possible edition is in the 1830 Book of Mormon. After that, and I'm going to burn through these. These are not necessarily why we're here, but after that, we start getting into the letter book of Joseph Smith. So here you have the letter book, which actually includes a couple of things. So these are dated in the summer of 1832. And so the reason in previous episodes, I've been explaining, hey, this is Joseph Smith's own hand writing his own history in 1832. The draft 2, draft 1, draft 3, the manuscript history of the church is 1838. So this is a very early history of the church. And so that history that we're describing is the front portion of the letter book that we're reading. So if you'd like to know, I've already been reading from this, leading up to the point where it stops becoming a history of the church account and starts becoming a copy of letters that were sent and received to Joseph Smith. And this was a more or less fairly common practice, and it makes a lot of sense. Hey, I just got a letter. I might lose this, or I might be needing to send it off to somebody else. I'm going to write it down in this book, and I'm going to shelve the book and keep it safe. And we still have that to this day, which is cool. So we get Frederick G. Williams' handwriting and Joseph Smith's own handwriting doing the history. And then when it becomes a letter book, it actually, so that history that he wrote, by the way, ends with basically Oliver Cowdery, in the storyline anyway, Oliver Cowdery wanting to be a scribe. We get a couple of things from this, which is fun. So in documents, they put them in at the time that the letter would have been received. So if you read the letter book, things are not in chronological order. And so for the sake of what the Joseph Smith papers have done, what we get right after section 19 is the preface to the Book of Mormon. And then after that, we get what's called letter number 6. And it was given, or originally written, I should say, in October 22nd of 1829. It is a letter to Oliver Cowdery. So Frederick G. Williams is the one that's actually writing and copying this letter into this letter book. But the original letter would have been in 1829. And what was interesting is this is actually a letter to them saying that Josiah Stoll wanted to buy copies of the Book of Mormon and to sell Joseph Smith a horse. And also, there's a lot of these letters are just like, hey, we're checking in on the family. How are they doing? Or, hey, we're in good health, or somebody is sick, or the weather is good and traveling has been great. And, they met us well and hailed us as friends and all this kind of stuff. So that is the first letter that we get. The next letter that we get is letter number 4. This comes in the 6th of November, 1829. And it's a letter from Oliver Cowdery, but what's fun about this is that it's written in Joseph Smith's own hand. And this is one of the rare things that we get, where we get a full document of just Joseph Smith's handwriting. And a lot of that's really rare. After this, it's almost all scribes. So anyway, what was interesting about this particular letter, it is the first time that I know of that we actually hear about somebody named Thomas B. Marsh. Now, this Thomas B. Marsh later becomes one of the original apostles. He's actually a seniority over Brigham Young. So in that case, he was older. What's funny about that is that it's not like it is today. We don't have a lot of standardized things. So there was a debate about who was older because they didn't really know when it happened. Obviously, that we're not synchronizing clocks around the country, and there's no standardized paperwork for these things. So there was a debate over who was the older person, but the original seniority of the 12 apostles just had to do with who was the oldest guy. So that went to Thomas B. Marsh. So he actually sort of was the superior officer, if you will, to Brigham Young in the Quorum of the 12. He actually later leaves the church over a local dispute. And I don't know if we're going to really necessarily get into this, but there was a debate, or a sort of a conflict between his wife and somebody else's about a saucer of cream and the strippings of those cream, and they were supposed to share portions of what this cow produced. And Sister Marsh felt like she was done wrong. Thomas B. Marsh came to her aid. It made it all the way to the first presidency. Nobody could resolve it, so Thomas B. Marsh left the church. And so the the story there is that it could have been Thomas Marsh University instead of Brigham Young University is the idea. So that's the position that he held. So anyway, this letter gives the progress of the printing, of getting the type, again, checking on the family. There is a postscript here, which I think is fun. It says, Oliver Cowdery says, P.S. I have just got to Alma, commandment to his son in copying the manuscript. We are all in tolerable health here, but my father's health is poor. So it's kind of funny. He's like, hey, by the way, remember that when he, talks to his son. That's where we are in the printing of it. So they're trucking right along here in November, which is cool. Anyway, so the next one we get after that is letter 2, which is a letter from Oliver Cowdery. And this is on the 28th of December, 1829. Again, the handwriting is Joseph Smith's. And there's some remarks that he's like, I never thought I'd be a printer. Now I'm a printer. And, I think that's kind of cool. Just the various things that he's been introduced to as a person involved in the restoration. And it seems like it's kind of fun. He's kind of like, man, I want this publication to end so that I can start his mission. Or so he can start his mission, which, this is something that we get in a previous revelation. So I just find it fun that, these guys are really excited about like what they're doing. They feel good about it. They want to move on. They want to do more. So it's really cool. And again, checking in with the family, people moving about, generally good health and spirits, things like that. So those are the documents that we get in the interim, a couple of things. And then we get into the portion which I like to call the promise. So this is an agreement with Martin Harris. So this is a little scrap of paper which says, I hereby agree that Martin Harris shall have an equal privilege with me and my friends of selling the Book of Mormon of the edition now printing by Egbert B. Grandin until enough of them shall be sold to pay for the printing of the same, or until such times as the said Grandin shall be paid for the printing printing the aforesaid books or copies. Joseph Smith, Jr. Manchester, January the 16th, 1830. Witness, Oliver H.B. Cowdery. That's what it says. Scrap of paper. Now, what's funny about this is there's, again, thank you to all the forensics that are done by the editors of the Book of Mormon, but for a long time they thought this was Joseph Smith's father. So that J at the end that says Joseph Smith Jr. looks a whole lot like an S. So the footnote here says the penultimate letter in this signature resembles more closely a capital S than a capital J. This apparently provided the basis for a notation in an unknown hand on the reverse side of the document, identifying the signer as Joseph Smith Sr. So here is the front of the document, and here is the back of the document. And on one side, you get, hey, this is Joseph Smith Sr., the father of the prophet. And on the other side of the document, you get Oliver Cowdery and some explanations about him. Just a scrap of paper explaining what it is. Isn't that cool? So looking at this, where do we get this from and how do we know this is real? So the source note for this from Documents Volume 1 says, it is unknown when autograph collector Simon Gratz acquired this document. According to the register of the Gratz collection, Gratz's entire collection was deeded to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1917 and finalized shortly after his death in 1928. So that's where we get it from. It just came into the hands of an autograph collector. And so he was collecting the autograph of what he thought was Joseph Smith Sr., but it wound up being actually Joseph Smith Jr., looking at it through various technologies that we have. So the historical introduction says, the contract in which Harris pledged his lands was apparently executed shortly after the revelation was announced. This is Revelation section 19. Joseph Smith and his associates initially planned to sell the Book of Mormon for $1.75, making it an expensive book in 1830. If they had sold all the books at that price, they would have collected $8,750. However, the price reportedly soon fell to $1.25, which still would have brought in twice the printing costs if all the copies had been sold. Cool. The historical introduction continues. Joseph Smith likely signed this agreement with Harris during a brief visit Joseph Smith made to Palmyra to settle a copyright dispute with Abner Cole. The agreement gave Harris equal privilege to sell copies of the Book of Mormon until he had been reimbursed for the value of his property mortgage to Grandin. So we've talked about that before, that he's going to try to get his money back, which is very interesting. So Martin Harris was very, very vehement on getting this thing sold. And he would take books with him everywhere, and he tried and tried and tried to sell as many as he could so that he could get his money back and pay his mortgage back, get his land back. So you might have heard this name twice now, Abner Cole, and a lot of you may not know this story. This is kind of a funny one. And what I would say is a little bit more akin to stories that you would hear from modern Latter-day Saint, instances of sort of following your spiritual gifts. It's kind of fun. So here you go. We get a little issue with a man named Abner Cole. And so this is from the Historical Introduction to Letter 2. So I'm going to go back and we're going to talk about letter number 2 just really quickly. Hiram Smith and Oliver Cowdery encountered difficulties with Abner Cole, editor of a local Palmyra, New York newspaper, The Reflector. In December of 1829, Cole announced to his readers his intention to begin publishing extracts from the Book of Mormon. And in January, he began circulating portions of the still unpublished book without Joseph Smith's permission. Cole produced his paper on, quote, nights and Sundays at E.B. Grandin's printing office in Palmyra, which gave him access to the pages of the Book of Mormon being printed there. It seems unlikely, however, that Cole's announced intention to print parts of the Book of Mormon prompted Joseph Smith Sr.'s decision to go, as the letter puts it, directly to Joseph Smith's home in Harmony. There is no evidence that Cowdery or Smith knew of the announcement, and the Reflector did not actually publish extracts from the Book of Mormon until the 2nd of January, 1830 issue. Lucy Mack Smith's account of the Reflector affair, while providing no dates, explains that that Hiram Smith and Oliver Cowdery were unaware of Cole's intentions when they went to the printing office on a certain Sunday after Hiram had a feeling of uneasiness. There they found Cole printing extracts of the Book of Mormon, and a verbal confrontation ensued, resulting in Cole's refusal to cease his operations. So this is kind of a fun one. Hiram Smith basically says, something's not right here. We need to go to the printing office for some reason. And they show up, and there's some guy there basically kind of stealing the text off of the pages that were printed and printing them in his own newspaper without permission. They get into an argument, they get into a fight, and at the end of it, Cole's like, I'm not stopping. I can do whatever I want. Right? And Grandin didn't care because he had already been paid. So it's not like he wasn't worried about losing any money by this thing circulating, in more places than just in his book that he was printing. So, footnote to this introduction, it's kind of fun. In the 9 December 1829 issue of the newspaper, Cole, under the pseudonym Obadiah Dogberry Esquire, which I wish was my name, which is, good on you for great pseudonyms, Obadiah, declared that since the Book of Mormon would not be ready for delivery for some months to come, at the solicitation of many of our readers, we have concluded to commence publishing extracts from it to appear in the near future. So that is the announcement that he was making. A later footnote states, according to Lucy Smith, after initial belligerence, Cole agreed to an arbitration of the matter. He discontinued his publication of extracts of the Book of Mormon after the 22nd January 1830 issue of The Reflector. And I'm not aware of us actually, we don't have any copies of this. I don't think it exists anymore, as far as we know. So that being done, we've kind of settled that. And again, none of these newspapers exist, which is kind of a bummer. It would have been fun to see that. But this is one of the reasons why Joseph Smith, got a copyright, so that if people did start copyrighting his stuff, he could arbitrate. He could go to court. And I believe they tried on a few occasions, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, so we have this whole thing with Martin Harris. He mortgages his farm. His wife is obviously not on board. They later separate, by the way. And all these things are going on. Whatever happened with this? Did Martin Harris lose his shirt? Did he lose his land? Did he lose anything else? He lost his wife. So what do we get? Well, here's from the historical introduction, again, of this piece of paper. It says, his efforts to sell the books continued even after he, Martin Harris, moved to Ohio in the spring of 1831. when his property was sold. If a later report is correct, Harris eventually recovered the money he had paid for the printing of the Book of Mormon. In 1853, he reportedly stated, quote, "I never lost 1 cent. Mr. Smith paid me all that I advanced and more too," unquote. So this has never really been stated, but it looks like in the midst of the mortgage that he was in, he decided to move locations. And so that's where in the previous part of this episode, they talked about how much the land was sold for and all that kind of stuff. But apparently this money, this agreement that they signed, this scrap of paper that we still have with Joseph's signature on it, that Joseph made it right. And that is something that I have seen a lot in the Joseph Smith papers. There's a lot of money loaned and a lot of money paid back. It's just the way that they did it. Their terms were a lot shorter maybe than they are today. It's not like he had a 30-year mortgage, which is the custom in our time. But anyway, I just thought it was interesting that according to Martin Harris, he did actually get his money back from the printing of the Book of Mormon. So that's part 3, the promise. And a couple of other things. Now, I'm giving an entire part here next to a revelation that was actually never published, so I hope you enjoy this. And forgive me in advance, just because I know some of you listen to the audio only, and it's going to be, I kind of doubt that you're maybe going to go look these up. I will be reading the entire thing out loud, so if that's too long, I apologize in advance, just something I'm playing with. But so part 4, our next part will be a revelation not published. Stay tuned. Okay, welcome to part 4, our final part of this episode that I've entitled A Revelation Not Published, because this is a revelation not published. Mind-blowing, I know. Anyway, so this is actually the end of what they call part 2 inside of Documents Volume 1. So we are moving right along in the chronology of the documents that we still have extant, according to the Joseph Smith Papers editors. So this revelation was given in, quote, early 1830. That's the best that we can do. For an introduction to this, it, as far as I know, and as far as I can see, has never been published in any publication of Joseph Smith or any in modern times. So where do we get it from? We get it from Revelation Book 1. It is called a commandment, AD 30. Looks like they forgot the M there, which is too bad. Excuse me. Very fancy handwriting, though, so thank you for that, John. It has some editing marks, so it looks like they were intending on publishing this, but it doesn't show up in the Book of Commandments. It doesn't show up in the Doctrine and Covenants during Joseph's lifetime or afterwards. So in Revelation Book 1, where this falls is after section 21. So it goes, we just had section 19, then we get section 21. And then there's a lot of these little revelations that we get, these little commandments that we get in Revelation Book 1. Those are later merged into section 23, what we now call section 23, the Doctrine and Covenants. And then we get this. So what are the circumstances around this? Where, it's only in Revelation Book 1. That's the only place you see it. It actually is surrounding the idea of securing a copyright for the Book of Mormon in Canada, what we would now call Canada. It was not called Canada at the time. We'll get to that in a second, too. So this is a shout out to all you Canadians out there. You know who you are. So the historical introduction for this one, it says, in January 1830, Abner Cole, who printed the Palmyra Reflector on the same press being used for the Book of Mormon, tested the pre-publication copyright, nice way of saying that, by printing a portion of the Book of Mormon in his newspaper without authorization. The problem was quickly resolved, in part because Joseph Smith asserted his copyright authority. Shortly after that confrontation, this revelation commanded Joseph Smith to expand copyright protection of the Book of Mormon throughout the world, which is what it talks about. Further to that, it says, although the agreement permitted Harris to collect $3,000 from the sale of the books, this revelation, possibly dictated about the same time, explicitly excluded Harris from sharing in the temporal blessings associated with the wider sale and distribution of the Book of Mormon. As shown in the text transcribed below, the revelation promised blessings to those who have assisted Joseph Smith. Quote, yea, even all save Martin only, which was scratched out later. 3 layers of deletion obscured Harris's name. Hiram Page later wrote that the necessary preparations for the trip to Upper Canada were made, quote, in a sly manner so as to keep Martin Harris from drawing a share of the money, unquote. So, Hiram Page, a little negative here. Let's talk about him for a second. So he is one of the 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, which would make sense why he was a part of this copyright securing thing going on in Canada. There is a revelation about him, actually, what we now call Section 28, which we will visit in a later episode, which had directed Hiram Page, who claimed to have a stone from where we could also receive revelations, to stop. And this is a revelation that secures this idea that there is only one person in the church at the time that has the right to receive revelations for the entire church. And this is this can get to be a sort of a debated or a sort of a sensitive topic where it's like, hey, I've received a revelation for you, and well, you don't have the right to do that. Only the prophet can do that. All that kind of stuff. That was the tone of voice of Section 28, directed at Hiram Page. He actually does put it aside. He says he had a stone that he was receiving revelations from. The Lord, so to speak, in this section, in Section 28, kind of says, no, that's not real, and put it away. And Hiram does. He actually acquiesces to it. So he's a pretty cool guy. He does leave the church in 1838, even though he was one of the 8 witnesses. And he joins Thomas B. Marsh, who, as we mentioned in a previous part of this episode, also left the church over a sort of a domestic dispute, so to speak, partnership between them and another family. Thomas B. Marsh starts what's called the Church of Christ, and Hiram joins that church in 1838. So he leaves the church before Joseph is killed. And so just a little bit about who he is. This revelation is interesting. And this might, depending on how you want to see this, in sort of bland terms, it doesn't seem to work or come to pass. But there are some interesting thoughts here that are written about this particular revelation. So just reading here from, again, the Joseph Smith papers, it says, Cowdery Page and likely the other 2 traveled to Kingston in response to the revelation, but they failed to obtain a copyright. A local resident apparently informed them that they were more likely to secure a copyright if they went to York, the capital of Upper Canada. But rather than travel more than 160 miles farther, they returned home and reported to Joseph Smith at the home of Peter Whitmer Sr. in Fayette. Almost 6 decades later, David Whitmer questioned the legitimacy of the revelation because of the group's failure to secure a copyright. He claimed that in a council held on the 1st of November 1831 to consider printing the revelations, Joseph Smith repudiated the revelation. Whitmer further stated that he and Jacob and John Whitmer were present when Cowdery and Page returned. Quote, we asked Joseph, he wrote, quote, how it was that we had received a revelation from the Lord for some brethren to go to Toronto, or Kingston as it was called at the time, and sell the copyright. And the brethren had utterly failed in their undertaking. Joseph reportedly inquired of the Lord through the Urim and Thummim, and according to Whitmer, received a revelation that stated, quote, some revelations are of God, some revelations are of the man, and some revelations are of the devil. Page, however, left no indication in his recollection that he was bitter about the revelation or his trip to Canada. So Hiram Page seemed to be okay with it. Now, this is according to David Whitmer, that Joseph repudiated it, got a revelation that said, yeah, maybe this wasn't a real revelation. However, the minutes of that meeting, which we have, make no mention of any of this. So do you want to believe David Whitmer, or, there's nothing in any other record that shows that ever happened? Hard to know. He had left the church later on in his life. So anyway, take that as you will. Again, we're just taking what we have in front of us. There's a couple of really interesting explanations to this, which I found interesting. So British common law at the time, and so this was all the Dominion of Britain at the time. This is 1830, but the British common law at the time required all copyrights to be obtained in an office in London, which would explain why the copyright to the whole world wording is in the Revelation. So copyright law wasn't changed until 1832, and it wasn't really enacted until 1841. So what was interesting is, even though they went, they would have had to go all the way to London to actually get a copyright that was respected in Canada, which would have also covered them in London. Now, eventually we did get those copyrights and all that kind of stuff, but just to kind of explain, like, there was a lot of very legitimate reasons why this never came to pass, in my opinion, based on this. So Footnote 7 from this revelation, which I thought was kind of fun, where they went to, was the 4 provinces likely referred to Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, Lower Canada, now Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, the 4 provinces that combined in 1867 to form the Dominion of Canada. So this is a pre-Canada that we're actually going to, which would make sense why getting a copyright would have been tough. So any of you who know Canadian history, any of you Canadians out there, I don't know if you know that 1867 was the date. I hope you do, because I'm not Canadian, and I feel like I would have known that. So I apologize that I didn't know that. That's a very interesting. I didn't know how it was formed. Enough about me. What I do love about this, and I will read it in a moment, is that there are 2 amens sort of written down. The first was an addition from Sidney Rigdon, possibly to cut the revelation short before the publication, since the rest had not come to pass yet. And the final is part of the original. So Sidney Rigdon went in there and he's like, why don't we just put amen here and just like not publish the rest of this, right? Anyway, it never got published in the first place. So, as the final portion to this is everything that I know about this whole thing. And I've given a little of the aftermath of what this was. If you will bear with me, I am going to now read the revelation that we get here. So enjoy. 23rd Commandment, AD 1830. A revelation given to Joseph Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Page, Josiah Stoll, and Joseph Knight Sr., given at Manchester, Ontario County, New York. Behold, I, the Lord, am God. I created the heavens and the earth, and all things that in them is. Wherefore they are mine, and I sway my scepter over all the earth, and ye are in my hands to do, to will, and to do, that I can deliver you out of every difficulty and affliction, according to your faith and diligence and uprightness before me. And I have covenanted with my servant, that earth nor hell combined against him shall not take the blessing out of his hands, which I have prepared for him, if he walketh uprightly before me, neither the spiritual nor the temporal blessing. And behold, I also covenanted with those who have assisted him in my work, that I will do unto them even the same, because they have done that which is pleasing in my sight. Yea, even all save Martin only, it be on one only. Wherefore be diligent in securing the copyright of my servant's work upon all the face of the earth, of which is known by you unto you, my servant Joseph, and unto whom he willeth, according as I shall command him, that the faithful and the righteous may retain the temporal blessing as well as the spiritual, and also that my work be not destroyed by the workers of iniquity, to their own destruction and damnation when they are fully ripe. And now behold, I say unto you, that I have covenanted, and it pleaseth me that Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Knight, Hiram Page, and Josiah Stoll shall do my work in this thing, yea, even in securing the copyright, and they shall do it with an eye single to my glory, that it may be the means of bringing souls unto me, salvation through mine only begotten. Behold, I am God, I have spoken it, and it is expedient in me, wherefore I say unto you, that ye shall go to Kingston, seeking me continually through mine only begotten. And if ye do this, ye shall have my spirit to go with you, and ye shall have an addition of all things which is expedient in me. And I grant unto my servant a privilege, that he may sell a copyright through you, speaking after the manner of men, for the 4 provinces of the people, if the people harden not their hearts against the enticings of my spirit and my word, for behold, it lieth in them to their condemnation and or to their salvation. Behold, my way is before you, and the means I will prepare, and the blessing I hold in mine own hand. And if ye are faithful, I will pour out upon you even as much as ye are able to bear. And thus it shall be. Behold, I am the Father, and it is through mine only begotten, which is Jesus Christ, your Redeemer. Amen. So that is a revelation on the books that was never published. I'd also like to point here just one last thing. The other 2 here that I didn't mention, Josiah Stoll. If you remember, he was the one that Joseph Smith worked for to look for treasure. in upstate New York. He's the reason why Joseph eventually met Emma Smith, and then, or Emma Hale, I should say, I'm sorry. And then you have Joseph Knight Sr., who was a very big proponent and supporter. So Josiah Stoll, if you don't know, actually gets his own revelation from Joseph Smith. So I apologize if that was too long, but that is the revelation. We'll conclude our episode here. I hope that's been enjoyable to you. And there are other things like that, which I think are really fun. Revelations that were never published. There's even a song that we'll get to maybe later on. But thank you again for your encouragement. Thank you so much again to the Joseph Smith Papers editors for all the work that they've done and for this wonderful series. I hope this has been interesting to you. Maybe clearing the name of Martin Harris a little bit, Joseph Smith, and giving you some extra revelations you never heard of before. So until then, amateur historian signing off, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.